Alrighty, we are going to we are not removing anything. We're going to review. Not that kind of class. We are going to review some of the things of Daniel's character. And if you have your sheet, that was the things we learned about Daniel, the sheet that was in your book, you can go ahead and pull that out. That would be helpful probably as we go through this. So we're really going to look chapter by chapter. Of course, we're going to skip chapter 3 because he's not in chapter 3. But we're just going to look kind of chapter by chapter. We're just going to kind of see and just kind of list things about Daniel's character, about what kind of guy he was. And we're going to see kind of as he grows and as he develops from a 17-year-old, captive to an 80 to 83-year-old grown man who really is high in the hierarchy of Babylon by the time we even get to chapter 6, and even more so by the time we get to the end of chapter 6. So, in chapter 1, just what are some words that would be used to describe Daniel?
Young.
Young.
Strong.
Strong how?
Strong character.
Like, what would make him have a strong character? Like, what kind of
Convictions.
examples?
I mean, he said he was
Convictions.
Yeah.
He was determined.
Yeah, very determined.
Unwavering, because he wouldn't.
Unwavering. That's a good one. I like unwavering.
I put faithful to God.
Yeah, he was.
To his God.
He was. And of course, the key verse of that is verse 8, when it says, Daniel set upon his heart or made up his mind that he would not defile himself. Like we talked about before, not every 17-year-old is going to have that mindset. Not every grown, 47-year-old is going to have that mindset to not, to go against the grain and to stand up for what they believe in. I mean, we see it, all over the place. I also put that he was respectful. It just respect for God and respect for the king and respect for authority, regardless of where it was coming from, really seems to be, to me, kind of a key characteristic to Daniel that plays out throughout his entire life. He's very respectful to the king, but yet maintains his faithfulness to God in that respect. A lot of people, I think, get this mindset of you have to be one or the other. If you're respecting the authority, especially if they're not godly authority, then somehow you're not being faithful to God. And so to be faithful to God, you've really got to be disrespectful to an ungodly leader. But that's not true. Daniel's a perfect example. He was completely respectful to leadership, to an ungodly leadership, several ungodly leaderships, but yet he was still completely faithful to God all at the same time. And one did not negate the other. As a matter of fact, I think his faithfulness to God is what actually led to him being able to be respectful to the authority and to the leadership that he was put. So, in chapter 2, how would we describe Daniel in chapter 2? This was Nebuchadnezzar's first dream, his statue dream.
God granted him favor, wisdom, and knowledge.
Yeah.
And
more.
Insight.
So do you think that God granted him wisdom and knowledge in Daniel 1, which it says he did, but then in Daniel 2, the wisdom and knowledge that God gave him, was that on top of what he already had?
I think so.
I think so too. I think so. I think he gave Daniel a little bit. Daniel was faithful. God heaped more. Daniel was faithful. God heaped more. Daniel was faithful. And because of his faithfulness, he was also blessed. God also blessed him. Continued to bless Daniel through these kings. What else?
He was loyal. He went to his friends.
Yeah, he was loyal to his friends. He didn't want to leave his friends behind. And it would have been really easy to say, well, yeah, I did this and I did this, or God led me to do this. But he brought his friends along. But were not his friends there? Did his friends not go and pray with him? Yeah, of course they did. So they were loyal. And it never shows that their friends tried to kind of ride his coattails. His friends never tapped him on the shoulder and said, hey, Daniel, we helped you do this, dude. You need to kind of, bring us along with you. It was like they were all, of almost one mind, like we read in Acts, going through this together. and one was not riding the coattails of the others. One of the words that I got out of chapter 2 was humble.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
Oh, you have that
I
too?
had that down to humble.
Yeah, he's very humble.
He always gave glory to God.
Always gave glory to God. He never even let it be thought that it was anything other than God. He made very sure that it was very clear and very plain that everything and every dream that he did, every success that he ever had, he only had because of God. It had nothing to do with the king. It had nothing to do with himself. It had nothing to do with this, wisdom of all this kind of conjuring and magical knowledge that he got for those 2 years. It was simply because of God. So humble, I think, is another, characteristic that kind of drove Daniel through his entire life. Now, chapter 3, we didn't have Daniel. Daniel wasn't there, so I think the key characteristic to there was absent. So then, chapter 4, what do you think about Daniel in chapter 4? This is when Nebuchadnezzar turned into an animal, or became animal-like.
I put that he was a straight talker. He wasn't fearful of telling the king what the dream was. I mean, he wasn't fearful of.
He was sympathetic too.
He was, and I think you're right, that's what I have. I have that he wasn't fearful of the king. But he was still respectful in his,
But he
He
was
told
sympathetic
him, but he
because-
told him straight out. He told him.
So he was truthful.
Truthful,
He had
yeah.
integrity. He had integrity, which is what we're going to talk about in chapter 6 when we get there. But yeah, he wasn't fearful. He was a straight talker. He didn't try to placate the king. He didn't try to soften anything for the king. But he also showed he cared for the king.
Yeah, I was going to say, but yeah. Showed
Because he said, I wish this was someone else. I wish this was your enemy. That this wasn't, you that I'm talking about here. I really wish.
And I really don't think it was to save his hide by saying that.
Oh no, I think he was sincere. I think
Yeah.
he was very sincere about that. I mean, by this time, he had been in Nebuchadnezzar's really
Service.
close, his service, rubbing elbows with him for quite a number of years. So yeah, I don't think he was trying to.
Yeah,
Schmooze him.
what do they call that when they, when people that are brainwashed go along with their captors?
Oh, like the
Yes.
Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm
Yeah.
syndrome.
It's like, you wonder.
Yeah, but he didn't, and that's what But he never tried to hide who he was either.
And it never says that he was treated badly in all this. You would think that there would be something like, they were treated bad, mistreated or something. They were oppressed or something, but it never says that.
Well, especially since we have more than Daniel's account of what happened in Babylon. I mean, we also have Ezekiel's account in Babylon. But yeah, and then we compare that, of course, to poor Jeremiah who was left behind. But yeah, you look at in Ezekiel, people were kind of free roaming and coming in and out and visiting people and all that. So yeah, you don't see this as another kind of Pharaoh, oppressive, slave situation. Because if it was, I think Scripture would have been very clear about that.
Well, the worst thing that happened to him is when they threatened to kill all the wise men. And
Well, yes.
And he said,
But that was across the
why
board.
do you want to kill us?
Yeah,
that
exactly.
was the worst thing he probably went through.
Right, and that was everybody. That wasn't just we need to find all the Hebrew people and we're going to go kill them all. It was his own Babylonian people, and then one poor lowly exile that happened to be in there. So yeah, we don't ever get the picture that they were treated harshly. This was not another Egypt scenario. But, what is that saying? A gilded cage is still a cage. They still couldn't go home. They were still in a foreign land, still run, by pagan kings, still run by pagan people.
As far as he knew, there was no home to go home to.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Because, until we get to chapter, what is it, chapter 7?
But we don't know what
right?
happened to his parents or family either.
Yeah, we don't know what happened to his family. Because it never says whether they were taken or not. No, it doesn't. No, so we don't know, how long do you mourn for that? And in all of that, it would have also been very easy for him to be very angry.
Better, yeah.
And because he was someone so high up, it would have also been very easy for him to have gotten kind of a coup together, with all these other young guys. And because he was so close to the king, he brought along his 3 friends. How hard would it have been for the 4 of them to get to the king by themselves? It would not have been difficult, but he didn't. because of his integrity, because of his respect, because of his faithfulness to God. Because he proclaimed, you're the one who puts kings, and you're the one who removes kings. You establish kingdoms, and you take away kingdoms. You know, God Most High, El Elyon, is the one, most, of course I'm not going to get it now. God Most High, now why can't I remember this? Oh, this is embarrassing. God Most High, why am I not getting this? Why is this like flying out of my noggin? I should be saying this in my sleep. This is like really bad, guys. God, yes, the God Most High is over the realms of man. He bestows it upon whomever he chooses. Thank you. I kept wanting to think God is in heaven and he sits on his throne and he does whatsoever he pleases, but that's from the book of Psalm. So I was trying to remember it in the book of Daniel, but Psalm kept wanting to slap up in my head. So in chapter 5, what do we see in chapter 5?
Belshazzar.
Yeah.
Beast.
The writing literally on the wall. And how does he behave? What kind of character traits do we see of Daniel in chapter 5? What do we learn about him?
He seems to be much older and he's not as patient.
He's really not. He's like, yeah, you know, your dad had a lot of years, you know, a year to kind of mess up and 7 years, but you're just going to be gone tonight. You know, I'm done. I don't have time to play. You're going to be gone. Next person's going to come in. And so, yeah, but again, just like Miss Marge said about chapter 4, he was not fearful of the king. He was not fearful to come in, not only in front of the king, but in front of all of the noblemen who were there, in front of everybody. He was not afraid to come in and tell the king, look, you know what? This is what your dad did. When he had that prideful heart, God humbled him, and basically there's no hope for you. I mean, you pretty much snubbed your nose right back out at God. And because of that, you're done. Like,
well, but
tonight.
he didn't repent. That's the problem with Belshazzar. He never even attempted to repent. He wanted to schmooze Daniel. Maybe he could, like, you know, play interference for him. But it never say he was repentant.
No, it never does. Well, but really, was Nebuchadnezzar before 7 years of living like an animal?
Well, he did acknowledge that Daniel's God was, or Daniel was at least, you know, he acknowledged something.
Throughout his years
Yeah.
of being there. And yeah, and we never hear anything about Belshazzar's rule, because it's not like he only ruled for this one day. But we don't know what kind of ruler he was, except for this one little picture that we get of him. So, like you said, we can only assume that this was kind of his attitude for his entire reign. That he never was repentant, that this was kind of an ongoing, you know, an ongoing thing. And he acted like he had never met Daniel before.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking that Daniel was long retired on his homestead and relaxed, you know, studying and all, and Belshazzar was doing what he wanted to do. That's why he didn't know. He didn't have the wise
Counsel of
counsel
Daniel.
of what he had Daniel or anything. He just did what he wanted to until his mother said, hey, you know, there was somebody that your dad used. Well, maybe his dad,
Right.
father, whatever.
And maybe you want to go get him. And he said, are you that Daniel? Are
Yeah.
you that one, that Daniel?
So he never.
But then in chapter 6, we see him coming out of retirement. Poor thing. He didn't stay retired for very long.
But see, at this point, he already knew the end of the story,
Yes.
because he had
Well, at this point,
knew the prophecies.
he'd been in captivity for 66 years. I don't know if in his working in prison, Chuck ever sees anybody who's been in prison for 66 years. And what that would look like if that person ever got out. Or what really,
So only 4 years
to
they
be-
would go back?
to be institutionalized like that.
So Daniel
But
was around
somehow
83.
Daniel really embodies the New Testament scripture that says we're to be in the world, but not of the world. Because he was very much in Babylon, very much a part of Babylonian culture and Babylonian society, but yet he was not of the world. He was not of that world because he did not partake of that culture. And we're not even told that he necessarily lived a very rich and lavish lifestyle.
Well, we're really not told anything.
No, we're not really told anything except that he had a house and he, went up to the window. But we're not really told how he lived. But I don't see Daniel as being someone who lived this ridiculously extravagant, in-your-face life either. Based on, the characteristics that we just went through, I don't think he would have been that kind of person. So we get to chapter 6, and chapter 6 is pretty interesting. And most people, when they hear Daniel or think about Daniel, they think this is the end of the story. And it's not the end of the story. It's kind of the halfway point of the story.
Actually, this comes up and people think that this happened when he was a young kid.
Yeah.
When he was
A young
boy.
Daniel, yeah. He was like an old guy going,
Here we go.
Not again, come on.
At least the other guys got to go on the fire when they were young, and I'm supposed to fight a lion when I'm old and I'm tired.
he was like, I'm too tired.
And I wasn't even out of retirement that long. Why couldn't I just stay in retirement and just enjoy my life?
Now we know what the lions didn't eat and they're like, nah.
He's kind of tough.
Too old and tough.
Too old.
By that point, he was jerky. But what are some of the characteristics that we see in chapter 6 of Daniel?
He's still loyal
He is still very loyal to who?
to God,
To God, and also to
the king.
the king. Yeah, to Darius, and also to Cyrus. They were co-regents. Cyrus isn't mentioned here, but we know that Cyrus was also there. He was very loyal. What does it say that he has? What kind of spirit does it say that he had? It says he had an extraordinary spirit. And when you look that up, guess what it means? He had an extraordinary spirit. So it doesn't really. So when they say that, it's right on. So he had an excellent spirit. What about his relationship with God? What do we see here about his relationship with God?
It's still solid to me. I mean,
Yeah.
He trusts God.
Yeah, he does. And we see that especially when we're looking at, when we get down, because we're going to take this kind of in chunks, when we get down to verse 10. Yeah, that's a lot of trust. He was thankful. I have that he was innocent and blameless. I do have he trusted God, and he continued to enjoy success, and he continued to prosper. But who prospered him?
God.
God prospered him.
And while he prospered, the king prospered.
Everybody prospered.
Because apparently the king showed favor towards Daniel.
Yeah, the king didn't really want to throw him in the...
No, he really didn't.
Didn't want to do that.
He
I mean,
really
He was
kinda
overjoyed when they took
between
him
a rock
out.
and a hard place.
Yeah, and because of these lovely satraps and these commissioners. So, let's look at and kind of reason out chapter 6, which we could probably all do in our sleep by this point in our lives. But at this time, how long, and we'd already said it, but how long had Daniel been in captivity by this point?
60-something years.
About 66 years. So how old is he by now?
83.
Yeah, between 83. I think
I put
83.
him at 80, yeah.
Some say 80, but it's somewhere in between there.
Somewhere around there.
So what, Darius had this great idea, or so he thought it was a great idea, and what was Darius's great idea?
Bow down and worship him.
No, look at verse 1. Darius, we're never told, tells them to worship him ever.
He set over the kingdom 120 satraps.
Yeah, and then what would they be in charge of?
The general population.
Yeah, I was going to
Yeah.
say over
But then over them,
It's the
what did he
governors.
set up?
The
three,
governors.
three
Yeah.
satraps.
The commissioners, and does your
Three
Bible say
administrators.
governors? Yours says
Governors,
administrators,
yeah.
governors? Okay, commissioners, same thing. So, we have he's kind of setting up this hierarchy of
But it
government.
says of whom Daniel was one, so he really wasn't in retirement.
Right, that's what I said, he came out of retirement real quick. He's now back in work. But he's not one of the 120 satraps. Which 120 satraps, in my mind, is kind of like a governor, or like a mayor, maybe, or a governor. But then over top of those 120 were only 3. So I don't know whether it was divided so that each one of those 3 was over like a region, so it would be like over 40 satraps, or whether they were over all 120, but the 3 of them just kind of acted as almost like a triumvirate, or a committee. But yeah, Daniel happened to be one of those commissioners, one of those higher up commissioners. But Daniel distinguished himself
And they didn't like that.
because he possessed that extraordinary spirit. So what did King Darius decide he would do for Daniel?
Set him up over everything.
He would be over everything. So now instead of this being a triumvirate, I don't know if he appointed another guy, so there would be 3, but then Daniel was the one. So you have to think about, the satraps probably didn't lose a whole lot of power, because they really didn't have a whole heck of a lot to begin with there being 120 of them. But those 3 commissioners had a lot of power in what went on in the kingdom, and probably had a lot of influence. Well, they did have a lot of influence over the king and what happened and the decision making. So they were able to kind of come to an agreement, or at least vote, and have this, basically have their way. Except now, there's that darn Daniel, that exile who shouldn't be here to begin with, this
He's
high
not
up.
one of us.
Exactly.
He's an outsider.
That is now going to be over us. He's now the boss. He now has the big ear of the king. So now everything that we used to do and kind of have vast authority over, we now have to go to Daniel, and we have to put it past Daniel, and Daniel has to agree with it. Because if he doesn't, then it's just not going to be done. And so up in them creeped that ugly green-eyed monster of jealousy.
I don't think it was jealousy. I think it was more of they wanted the power.
Oh, I think they were jealous. Because why couldn't one of them do it? Why couldn't one of them be? They were at least Babylonian. They grew up there all their life.
I'm sure jealousy felt, but I think it's more of, their power structure.
They were losing. They were not going to be as powerful as they were, but I think they were also jealous. Why should he, an exile, why should he get it?
So they decided to impeach him.
So they decided to impeach him. Yes, they did. They decided to impeach him. So, evidently, they decide to go to the king. But before they go to the king, they have kind of this little powwow together. Because they have to come up with a plan. And they have to come up with a really, really good plan. Because even if these satraps, these commissioners are a lot younger than Daniel, they at least knew Daniel's reputation. I mean, Daniel had been in Babylon a long time. So they knew what he was about. They probably, if they were a lot younger than Daniel, when they were probably sitting in their, in their schooling or whatever, they probably learned about Daniel. They probably learned about this extraordinary man.
They knew about the writing on the wall?
Oh, I wouldn't doubt it a bit.
This didn't happen a long time after that.
No, and we don't,
it looks like it was almost
pretty close.
pretty close right after that happened, so they had to know that he was the one that read the writing on the wall.
And
They
he's
had to
always
figure this out.
been higher up, which draws in, which is magnetic to a lot of people. So yeah, his reputation was probably pretty.
They were probably learning
extensive.
about him in history.
Well, I don't know.
Well, yes, because Babylonians love to write down their history. And so if you're sitting there and you're learning how to be, this wise man, and you're learning the history of the land, then why wouldn't you hear about the man who, with Nebuchadnezzar and with Belshazzar and with his other 3 sons that were in there?
Well, with a hint and a tilt towards Babylonian.
Oh, I'm sure, but they still knew about him. They still had to know his reputation. So they knew that they couldn't just go to the king and complain and whine or make up something. So to give these guys a little bit of credit, they did actually try to find something that he'd done wrong before they made up a lie. But at least they kind of started out on the right track. So in verse 4, on what grounds did they try to base their accusations on? In verse 4.
Something that he done wrong in the kingdom.
Yeah, something he had done wrong in the kingdom. Some law of the kings that he had disobeyed. Well, were they very successful?
Nope.
No, they
They could
failed.
have made something up.
Right, but that's what I said, but they
Hillary
didn't,
wasn't
so
there.
at least, they didn't. So then what did they decide they were gonna base it on? If they couldn't base it on,
Entrapment.
no, on the affairs of the government, what grounds were they gonna try to base it on?
Concerning the laws of his God.
Of his God.
Yeah, they were gonna entrap him.
But into his God. Now, I don't know if that meant, because at this point there's no law that people can't worship who they want to worship. I mean, there have been so many declarations about the God of Daniel and the God of Israel. So I don't think they were trying to do that unless they were trying to see if he had maybe done something
Immoral.
immoral or broken God's law, that they could then go to the king and say, hey, he's not the best person for the job, because he's done this, this human thing or whatever. But were they successful in that? Not really. So then they had to come up with something else. So then they tried to flatter Darius into trapping Daniel, who very obviously that Darius cared a lot about. Darius maybe even looked up to him as a father figure, because Darius was not as old as Daniel. He might have also been very impressed at the way Daniel treated him, because he probably treated him with a lot of respect, with a lot of integrity. Again, we get that integrity in there. And that word, we see it twice, that they came by agreement. It's in verse 6 and then it's again in verse 15. That came by agreement is regash, and it means by thunder. So if you kind of think of, the thundering herd, these men kind of came in together, kind of almost like an army of, of a few, but they came in, these commissioners, these satraps, came in as just one big kind of thundering into the king. And they greeted him in a very Babylonian way, which was the wish, that he would live forever. But then, in verse 7, what's the one word lie? Maybe it was an exaggeration. Maybe it was a lie on purpose. But what's the one word lie in verse 7? In my translation, it's the very first word.
All the governors of the kingdom?
All. All. Did all agree?
No, it was just the three of them, wasn't it?
Well, it says the satraps did come, so there would have been,
Well, Daniel didn't agree.
Daniel didn't even know about it. So not only did all not agree, but all didn't even know about it. And it doesn't tell us if all 120 satraps were there or not. And, I can't see Darius at this big thundering herd, kind of come into his chambers to have a discussion with them. And then I don't see him going, okay, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and getting to 120. I don't think he bothered. It's just here we are, this big group, and, this herd mentality, this mob mentality, and we all agree, all of us agree, like through the whole kingdom, all of us agree that this is what should happen. And you know what, though, King Darius? It's really good for you. Because they stroked his ego.
I wonder how Cyrus felt about that, though.
I don't know. I have no idea. As his cohort, I have
Yeah, because
no idea. Or his
that's-
co-regent.
That's
Yeah. He would have been, and Cyrus would have been higher, really under more authority. I don't know, because I don't know where Cyrus is at this point. We're never told.
Are they co-regents at this point?
Yeah, they stay co-regents. I mean, Cyrus eventually did die off, but it's my understanding that yes, they were, because Cyrus actually is the one who allowed them all to go home after the 70 years.
Right.
So so they were co-regents from the very beginning, because there was a war between Persia and Mede, and they kind of all kind of came to this agreement that they would kind of band together and make this one kingdom, and that's why it's the Medo-Persian kingdom. So even though they were co-regents, the Persians were always, you know, in more authority. And Darius, of course, was the Mede.
Well, I wonder if their regency, their co-regency was like, this is my area and this is your area.
And it could have been territorial.
Yeah, so Cyrus was in a different,
Part
like
of
the northern region and the southern region,
Right.
you know.
And it's very possible. I mean, it's absolutely possible that it was a regional regency, but it was a regional thing. Because we know that nowhere in here does he ever have to ask Cyrus anything
Right.
or for permission for anything. So that would make a lot of sense. So, what did they tell King Darius would just be this great document and this great law for him to write?
A decree that no one should pray to any other man or god for the next 30 days except for you.
Except for him. Or what would happen to him?
Thrown in the lions.
Oh yeah, they wanted to make sure that there was a punishment. Because they just couldn't say, oh yeah, we have, because they knew Daniel wasn't going to do this. But they wanted to make sure that the punishment was not a little slap on the wrist. They wanted to make sure whatever the punishment was, that it would get rid of Daniel. That Daniel would be gone. There'd be no more Daniel. Which really was the whole point of making this thing anyway.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what was the point of was there any significance to the 30 days? And it's like,
I have no idea. Maybe it was just, they knew he wouldn't sign it if it was forever.
They didn't need it to be forever. They just needed to be enough time to entrap
For
them.
them to grab Daniel. That's all they needed. 30 days. Now, the reason I say that I believe his reputation preceded him, or that they knew something of Daniel, is because they knew that Daniel would never follow this. They knew that Daniel would not pray to a king or pray to an idol of the king. They knew that about him. And it was not even a doubt in their head that Daniel would even go along with this. Or Daniel didn't even have to pray to the king. Daniel could have just decided to stop praying. Or, what makes more sense is, Daniel would have prayed kind of the way we pray. Kind of while we're walking, while we're driving, you know, and
or
somebody...
behind closed doors.
Yeah, behind closed doors. He didn't do it. He did not change. And you can say, well, that's kind of hubris. And isn't Daniel pushing God by saying, hey, you know, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to thumb my nose at the king and I'm going to do what I've always done because God will protect me and so just whatever.
Yeah, but the thing is, he prayed in his home.
Yes,
So-
but he prayed at the what?
Window.
At a window. He prayed at a window. But
Well,
Let's
where
back
the
up.
windows open toward Jerusalem. It didn't say he prayed by the window.
oh, he would
I
have
mean, he
been
could
at
have
the
been
window.
right here and looking out the window. I mean, they really had to
Yeah,
get him.
but I mean, this must have been his routine, and they
Yeah.
knew it.
Oh yeah, and they knew it. And they knew he wasn't going to change it. Otherwise, and maybe that's why they only made it for 30 days in case they couldn't catch him for those 30 days. So that would be kind of gone. They'd have to come up with a plan, what would be now a plan D. What was the catch though about this law? What was the catch? Which is really why they wanted him to sign it to begin with and not just say it.
Because it couldn't be changed once it was
Oh,
It could-
enacted.
Right. Where else do we see in Scripture, where else do we see this quandary where a law is written and couldn't be undone? By a Persian king. King Xerxes with Esther.
Oh, right.
And so he just had to write another one that allowed them to defend themselves. And so that's how they were able to defeat him. But yeah, and when he realized what he had done, you know, both kings reacted in the same way. But one for the love of his queen and one for his care and concern over his friend, over Daniel. But yeah, we see that again in Esther. So, in verse 10, did Daniel know about the decree?
yes.
Yeah. Because it tells us right there. Daniel knew it
He
had
learned
been
the
signed.
decree had been published.
But he went into his home, in his roof chamber. He had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he kneeled on his knees 3 times a day, praying, giving thanks to God, as he had done previously, which can also be translated to because he had always done it. These are some cross references up here about praying toward Jerusalem. Your cross references are 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 44 through 49, and Jonah chapter 2, verse 4. And then a cross reference for praying 3 times a day is in Psalms 55, verses 17 through 18. So that's what those cross references are for. Daniel,
Was that a Jewish custom to pray 3 times a day?
it still is. It still is. Morning, noon, and night.
How often do the Muslims pray?
3 times.
3 or 5.
I think
I thought it was more than 3. Is it not? I have no idea.
And they have to face the east
Yeah, to Mecca.
to Mecca.
No, I was just wondering, where do you think they got that from?
Yeah. It's because of Abraham, Isaac, and
No,
Jacob.
I meant where the Muslims.
Oh, absolutely. Well, because they're from Ishmael, the son of Abraham. So, Daniel was faithful, even in danger. He kneeled, he prayed, he gave thanks. He learned to be very consistent in his life. He had seen kingdoms and kings come and go. He had watched his land kind of come and go. He'd watched friends come and go. He watched families get separated. He'd been through a lot. He'd been through a lot of trauma. But he knew that God, Most High, never leaves and he never changes. So men catch Daniel praying, and of course they can't wait to go run and tell the king and tattletale. And they can't reverse the decree to save Daniel. But who does Darius, and way down in verse 16, who does Darius say actually will save him?
His God.
Yeah, he said, your God whom you
Sir.
constantly serve will himself deliver you. And of course he said this right as Daniel was being chucked into the lion's den. And another name for that lion's den is, it's like a cave full of lions. We always think of it as a pit, but the den, exact translation is a cave. So that's why a big rock was rolled in front of it, and there Daniel stayed. How does Darius, how does his night go?
Restless.
Yeah.
He did not sleep. He was worried.
He not only didn't sleep, what else did he need to do? It says he fasted.
Yeah, I found that interesting.
I did too.
Of course.
Because what would you think that they would have said about a pagan king? He didn't eat. He didn't eat all night. He didn't take in nourishment. He neither ate nor drank. That's what you would expect to see, is that, just something that said he didn't eat and drink. Fasting, I think, is a very interesting word. And
Well, mine doesn't say fasting. Mine just says that then the king returned.
Verse
Spent the
18.
night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not. I lost his appetite. He was worried.
But that word is the same word used
Because fasting,
in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 16 and 17, when it means they're actually fasting. And if
yeah, that's
you
what I was
want
gonna say. Mine doesn't say
to turn to
fasting.
that. I'll look real quick. 2 Samuel. Where was I? Oh, come on. 2 Samuel 12, 16. 2 Samuel 12. 16 and 17 to talk about David. David therefore inquired of God for the child. This was when his child with Bathsheba. And David fasted and went and laid all night on the ground. And the elders of his household stood beside him in order to raise him from the ground, but he was unwilling and would not eat food with them. So it's fasting in mourning is what it is. And it's the exact same word that David did when he was trying, because his son with Bathsheba had gotten sick.
Yeah, I
He
know
was gonna die.
that story.
Okay, and so, yeah, so it's the same word that he fasted. He was fasting and mourning. Not to say that other, pagan gods, they didn't fast, but I just think it's very interesting that they use the word fasting and not, he just didn't eat. So it's very interesting.
What version are you reading from?
Nasby.
Oh, I'm not got it IV right now.
So, how did Daniel's night go?
It's quite quiet.
Yeah, it was like, it's
It
a little
was-
chilly, but smells a
It
little,
wasn't too uncomfortable, a little smelly.
yeah, a little smelly, but
If you'll believe the children's book that somebody gave one of our kids when they were babies, he spent the night eating pizza with the lions. I'm thinking, eating pizza with the lions. I'm thinking,
Well, it
don't-
can't be, because they shut the lion's mouth. so-
Exactly. I'm wondering.
They-
Well, and I'm wondering where they got this little 2-year-old looking kid that's eating pizza with the lions, and who delivers to the lions den, right? I don't think Domino's does that. But yeah, so I laugh and I'm like, what are we putting in our kids' heads? Yeah, Daniel didn't have such a bad night. It doesn't say Daniel slept, but I don't think Daniel stayed up all night restless either. Because just like
I
Shadrach,
bet you he was praying.
Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel didn't spend the night by himself.
Yeah, it says that making petitions and supplication before God, so he was praying.
But who
God
else?
sent an angel
And God sent an angel.
who shut the lions' mouths.
Now, whether this again was a Christophany or whether this was just one of his messengers, we don't know. It could have been the exact same angel. It could have actually been an angel that Daniel had already seen because he'd already talked to Michael and Gabriel. So it could have been one of them that actually came and shut the lion's mouth. And Daniel would have been like, oh, I remember you. You're the man in my dream. So, yeah, but it's just interesting. And I wish I knew kind of where these visions ended up, in relationship. We know, for instance, like things, some of the visions were between 5 and 6, but I would love to know where they really were, like how close they were, because we know chapter 6 literally is the end of the story, because 7 through 12 just kind of fit within these chapters. But yeah, it could have been one of the angels, Michael or Gabriel, that he'd already talked to, that he'd already seen in the vision, that had already spoken to him. And I have to wonder also if he's been given all of these visions, or he has been given all of these visions to know about what's going to happen in the end, if that's not what helped really gird him up to be able to speak to the kings the way he did, to be able to know, because he did have a glimpse at what was going to happen at the end. Near time and far time prophecy. Well, really near time, kind of midway, and then end time prophecies. So it would just be really neat to know, just to get a better picture or a more complete picture of Daniel's mindset. And I did something I swear I never do, but I did look at commentaries because I just wanted to see if somebody had some idea of where kind of these things, time-wise, on like a giant, 66-year timeline, where those visions, how far away from the verses that we have, or the chapters that we have, where it actually came in. And they're all over the place, so I was going to print it all off and be really smart and look smart, but they were all over the place, so I figured I'm not going to do that. So, in verse 20, what is the first thing Darius does when he jumps out of bed as soon as daybreak comes?
He cried out to Daniel.
Well, he ran to, or he went fast to the place where Daniel was thrown, and he called out.
Yeah, and he asked a very interesting question.
Did your God
Save
you?
whom you constantly serve,
Yeah.
Has he been able to deliver you?
has he been able to deliver you from the lions? And I can only imagine
That's a nice song.
how, before Daniel went in, or as he's being thrown in, the king is very steadfast. Your God will be able to deliver you.
Whom you constantly serve.
Somewhere in that night, his bravery or his trust in God, or whether it was real trust or whether it was just this doubt, started creeping in. Because when he goes, He doesn't say, Daniel, come out, I know your God saved you. He said, probably through the rock, Daniel, was the God whom you constantly serve able to deliver you? And Daniel says, yeah. My God actually sent an angel. And the angel shut the lion's mouth. But why? Daniel even gives a reason why the mouths of the lion were closed. Why?
Because I was found innocent before him.
Before who?
God.
And
Also toward you, O king.
the king. He said, God searched me, judged me, and found nothing wrong. I was innocent, so I didn't get punished. There was no judgment. Contrast that with what happened when God judged Belshazzar.
He was found wanting.
He was found wanting. He was numbered, he was weighed, he was found wanting, and so his kingdom was taken from him. Daniel was weighed and found not wanting, found innocent. He had done nothing wrong against God, and he had done nothing wrong against the king. So, these poor guys, what happened to their accusers?
And Job is probably saying, how come he gets off?
Yeah, exactly. You found me just as innocent, and look what happened to me. And you left my wife. You couldn't take her. And these three good-for-nothings. So, what happened to Daniel's accusers?
Ah,
They were mincemeat.
But not just them.
their families.
Wives and kids.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of their families. And if you want one for their children being killed, Deuteronomy 24:16. Their wives, and they hadn't even reached the bottom before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, the Bible kind of glances over that they brought those men. We tend to see, or we tend to think it was a couple of men. If you go back to verse 6, it says, these commissioners and the satraps. We don't know how many satraps actually came in to be this thunder in agreement to come into the king's chamber to suggest that he do this, to write this decree. We also don't know how many were actually doing it to get back at Daniel, or how many of them were doing it just because they thought it'd be a really good idea, or how many of them could have been bullied by the commissioners into doing it. You know, political corruption, go figure, right? So, we don't know. But it doesn't say just the commissioners. It says these men who had acted maliciously accused Daniel, and he cast them and their children and their wives. This could have been a whole lot of people going down in the lion's den. Pagans didn't tend to only have one wife, first of all. I mean, so just the wives and the kids could have been a lot. Let alone, we don't know how many men. So this was pretty devastating because the whole governmental system that Darius had set up is now pretty much gone and pretty much non-existent.
Now, maybe it was the government system left over from the previous administration, and he was just trying to cleanse the...
To clean it out. Wouldn't we love that? Come November, come, right? But it does say that Darius did appoint these people. So, in verse 1. So, Darius did do it.
It reminded me of that, the last Sunday school lesson we had where the ground opened up and swallowed up the guys that were
Yeah.
Against Aaron and Moses, were jealous of them and tried to
Become the priests.
become the priests. Yeah.
Yeah, the whole, yeah, we have the pictures over there where they just opened it up and
The
then,
ground
yeah.
opened up. This reminded me of that when it's
The
like,
ground opened
now
up
all
on
those people.
Aaron and his sister.
Well, Miriam, they got leprosy.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, when God decides to protect, not when he decides to protect his people, when God decides that this is the order. This is the order that I want things in. And we try to sneak our way in, or we try to bully our way in. You know, God's not going to let His order like be overthrown. And He may allow it to be overthrown, like He gave Israel into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar to teach them a lesson. But He's not going to allow us. We can't bully God into changing His mind, or to saying, well, that's not fair, so we're just going to go and kind of bullhorn our way into it like these men did, and then stand around and not expect any repercussions. So 25 through 27. This is the Darius's declaration, his new declaration. Oscar, you want to read that for us? Verse 25 through 27.
Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God and enduring forever, and His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and His dominion will be forever. Finish 27. Sorry.
He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian.
A lot of people will read that and think that Cyrus came after Darius, that there's two kings. He's talking about two kingships and two kingdoms, but we know through our study that it was actually a co-regency. Some people think, oh, Darius, and then he was also there for Cyrus. Well, they were there together. It was not two separate kingdoms. So,
but see, Darius was the Mede, and Cyrus was
the Persian.
Over the Persian area. I think that's kind of the way I.
That's what would make sense. Then our homework took us all over the Bible to something that actually, we'd like to think that we have, and we'd like to think that we don't really need to study about or even learn about, and that is integrity. Integrity was a driving force in Daniel's life. And I have to believe it didn't happen when he suddenly found himself captive in Babylon. I believe this was probably his way of life, all even growing up. So, they asked us to look up a definition of integrity. Did anybody Google integrity or look it up in their dictionary?
I looked it up.
Okay, what'd you get?
Integrity. An unimpaired condition, soundness, firm adherence to a code or ethical, moral, or artistic value, incorruptible, a state of being complete and undivided.
All right, anybody live according to that definition of integrity? All the time? I'm trusting you have integrity to answer the question. One of the things that when our oldest son was going to take classes at UTC, they have this whole interview process. And so when he went into the teacher, one of the things the teacher asked him on the spot is, what is integrity? He's 16. What is integrity? And he said, it's doing the right thing when nobody's watching.
Mm-hmm.
Doing the right thing when nobody's watching. And he got in. And the teacher said, he is the only one who knew what integrity was, or had any definition, or had any thought about what integrity was, or what integrity is. Doing the right thing, having that moral uprightness, having those principles, having that attitude, not the hubris, but the attitude of, this is what God says, and I'm not going to waver. I'm not going to move from that. I'm not going to, as the Bible says, I'm not going to lean to the left or the right. I'm going to stay on that course. And it's not easy, because even Daniel and even with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, obedience and integrity have a cost. They're not cost-free. They're not, consequence-free. Because this world does not operate under the guise of integrity. It almost acts counter to integrity because they want you to waver. They want you to kind of just do it. They want you to kind of make up your own thing.
Just go with the flow.
Exactly. Go with the flow. Follow us. Do your own thing. Be your own person. Be not a person if you don't want to be a person anymore. Be something else. Be a bunch of number codes if that's what you want to be. But yeah, so it's actually anti-integrity because one of the definitions that Mark said of integrity is unwavering. You don't move. And this world just wants you to be very, very fluid in what you believe. Oh, it could be this or it could be that or it could... No, God said one way, not multiple ways, one way. And so it's hard to stand on integrity. It's hard because, there are consequences for that today. And so we looked at several verses in Psalms, in 1 Kings, several in the book of Job, in Matthew chapter 5, and then we looked at King Solomon and kind of his fall from integrity. So what did we learn about David from the Psalms? What kind of man was David? And every one of these verses uses the exact same word, because I looked up every one of them, for the word integrity. And it's T-O-M, and it means exactly what March said for integrity. It's just this innocence, this fullness, this completeness, the simplicity, the moral uprightness, which moral uprightness would also be, righteousness. And so all of them use the same word, and it's all that word T-O-M, tone. So, David, what did the Psalm say about David? What kind of man was David?
A man after God's own heart.
He was. It says he's a man of righteousness and, of course, integrity. And even though he opposed those around him, who did he call on? Who did he allow to vindicate him? God. Yeah, he didn't go after people himself. He called out to God. He trusted God to take care of the situation. He didn't try to go out and vindicate, his enemies. He didn't try to vindicate himself or seek revenge. He asked God to do it, and then he waited for God to do it. He didn't try to preempt God, like so many in the Bible and so many standing here tried to do. In 1 Kings chapter 9 and then in chapter 11, he did say that he was a man after God's heart. Where did it say integrity came from? Where was his integrity found? In his heart.
And this was at what?
In 1 Kings 9.
1 Kings.
Yes, 1 Kings 9 and then 11:4. His heart was wholly devoted to God. And his integrity, his unwaveringness, if that's a word, unwaveringness, was following God's commands. And then we got into poor Job. Poor Job.
And Matthew talks about integrity being from the heart too.
Yes, it does. Now Matthew 5 is very, very interesting. Matthew 5:27 through 28 is very interesting because when you see, I'm going to turn there right now, when you see the words, you have heard, or it has been said, but I say, and that's kind of a whole formula, especially in the book of Matthew, but you see it in all of the Gospels. And it's right there in verse 27. You have heard that it is said, you shall not commit adultery. And where do you see that? That's in Ten Commandments. Mm-hmm. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now that lust is to show a focused passion as it aptly builds upon what a person truly yearns for. And if you want to, it's a EPI Thumeo, epithumio, and it's of course in Greek. But when you see that formula, you have heard, but I say, that is a fence around the Torah. The famous fences around Torah. And so the formula goes, you have heard, this is an ear for heard, but I say. And that is a fence. And it's called a fence around Torah because we know the Ten Commandments, you don't commit adultery. So adultery is in the middle. But I say, you don't look at a woman with lust in your heart, because if you have, you've already committed the adultery. So the fence is, if you don't look at another woman or at another man, for us women, with lust in your heart, then you're not going to get to the adultery. So if you don't jump this fence of looking at them with lust, you're not going to get to this adultery. So when Jesus says, I say, you have heard, but I say, people will preach, and it drives me nuts. They will actually preach that Jesus is changing things, that Jesus is making a new world order out of things, that Jesus is rewriting the law. That Jesus did no such thing. What he was trying to do was really to protect. Because, you're not going to, if you don't look with lust, you're not going to fall into adultery. We do it all the time with our kids. We just don't think of it as putting a fence around it. Our kids are not allowed to go on dates one-on-one. They have to pick kind of a chaperone. And they either pick an older sibling or Oscar and I go. And so 9 times out of 10, our poor oldest daughter ends up being everybody's date chaperones. Because that's the fence. That's the protection. Because if you have someone there, a third person, then there's not going to be there's not going to be a he said, she said, because there's a witness. You're not going to be tempted into doing something you're not supposed to do because someone's there to make sure that, hey, that you don't do it. That's a fence. We put that fence around them. We tell them, except my dad just tells us to go play in traffic, but, we build fences around our house. Why? To keep people from coming in. Or to keep things from going out, like our dogs or our children or whatever. That's all Jesus is doing when he does that. And you see this formula all the time. But what you have to think is, not Jesus is rewriting it, and Jesus is saying, every time you look at a woman, you're committing adultery in your heart, so you're breaking the 10 Commandments. If you break one law, then you broke all of them, and so you might as well go out and kill somebody because you're just as guilty. Or we all have to walk around like this and hope for the best that we don't cram into somebody. It's not what he's doing. He's saying if you don't look at them with lust, then you're not going to hit adultery. So it's an extra layer of protection, and it's called a fence around the Torah.
Our Bible school taught this same thing.
Praise God, because nobody does. Praise God.
They taught the pastors, the guys that were going to be pastors, you need this fence so that you cannot ever be put in a compromising position. You know, if you have to take a lady somewhere, she's in the back seat. If your wife's not with you, she's in the back seat, It's like, and everybody laughed. They thought that was funny, but it's like, that's... It keeps the rumors from going, and it keeps the integrity intact.
Yeah. And it's the fence, and it's not just around adultery. It's around, he says, you've heard it said that, like not to call your brother a fool, but if you do, but I say, what does it say? Thou shalt not murder. But I say, don't call your brother, don't say raka, don't call him, that you're worthless. Because when you start with words and things get heated with words, we see it with our kids, when things get heated with words, it doesn't take very long before fists come out. Or before people can get so upset and so angry that they pick up something else, and inadvertently, in the heat of the moment, somebody either gets hurt or gets killed. So You've heard it said, don't kill. Well, yeah, don't kill. I mean, we all know that. But I say, don't even start with a verbal fight. Don't even start with name calling. Because then you won't have to worry about your anger being so revved up that something's going to happen. So you just don't. That's another offense. So it's not just with adultery, it's with a lot of the commandments that Jesus says, yeah, these are great commandments, but let's just go a little bit further and let's just build a fence to make sure it never escalates to that. Let's put a fence around it. So that's what it is. Jesus didn't change anything. But one of the things she wanted us to see is that in the Hebrew mindset, of course, thoughts, emotions were always in the heart. That's where it started. For us, we know that our thoughts and intentions come from our head, not necessarily from our heart. But what comes first, a thought or an action? A thought. Thoughts turn into actions.
Well, generally.
Yes.
Sometimes people act without thinking too.
Yeah, well, that's true. So, isn't it interesting that sin and integrity both originate from the exact same place? It's all a heart issue. Sin and integrity come from the same place. It's not the thought or the feelings, but what do you do with them? Do you sin or do you maintain your integrity? And that's a constant battle. And for some people it's an easy battle. God love them. And for some people it's not an easy battle. And God bless them. But always, it's always this battle. And we saw it best with Solomon. Solomon built God's temple. Solomon was a man of prayer. But then Solomon was led astray by his, 1,000 wives and concubines.
He was, but he had a choice.
He did. He absolutely
He made the choice.
He did. I'm not saying anybody made him do it. I'm just saying, he had the thoughts and they became wrong actions. And even though he was described, he was a virtuous man, God allowed him to build the temple. He was a man of prayer. He was a godly man to start out with.
And to end with, I think.
His heart curved from the thoughts being righteous and integrity to his thoughts leading to sin and idolatry. Because he actually built, while he was building the temple of God.
I think a lot of it, before even he got to the sin of idolatry, I think it was lust and
Oh, absolutely.
whatever.
For foreign women.
He had to have these wives,
Well, but I'm sure a lot of it was political too.
And they were the ones that got him,
That talked him into it.
yeah. And then he had to satisfy them, so he built temples for them to worship their gods and
And then these other ones got mad, so he had to build temples to worship theirs. And pretty soon, the country is full of, of this idolatry and these idolatrous temples. And then here's God's temple. And you look around and you go, wow, okay, but there's God's temple, and then there's Asherah's temple, and then there's this person's temple, and there's Baal's temple, and here's, all these other temples around. So what does that put God? I mean, where's the hierarchy if there's all these other things? Then there's obviously not one God in the land. And this was in God's land. This was in, this was in Israel, because this was not a divided country yet.
So what did you think about Job?
Oh,
What did you have to say about Job?
poor sweet Job. I feel bad for him. He was blameless and he was upright. He was a God-fearer. He did turn away from evil, and there was no one on earth like him. I have that even when suffering great loss, Job didn't sin or blame God. Job, just like Daniel, understood in God's sovereignty. And of course, he also made a covenant with his eyes not to look, at women with the idolatrous thoughts. And he guarded his heart, he guarded his eyes. Of course, I don't know why he would think he'd be much of a catch covered in leprosy and like penniless.
No, I think that was
Basically, it was,
Before.
yeah, it
And
was.
he was rich and prosperous
yeah.
with a nagging wife.
But he also says, he set up his life that this was what what he was going to do. This is how he was going to live his life. Just like Daniel had to set in his mind that this is how I'm going to live my life, and this is what I'm going to do, and this is the road I'm going to take. Job did the same thing, and in both men, or in neither man, did we see any wavering. We never saw any wavering with those men, ever. And Daniel, compared to Job, had it very, very easy. Because Job had a lot of people, including his friends and his wife, his lovely nagging wife, constantly, at him, just do it. Just speak against God. Just let him kill you. Just let you be done. Stop the suffering. Stop. And Job said, I'm not going to do it. Because he had already set his mind. He'd already put on the God blinders, and that was the direction he was going to go, regardless of what happened. And so in his suffering, he still chose integrity. But he knew where his suffering came from. He knew that that God, I have to be careful when I say, he knew that this was a test for him. Because when you read the whole book of Job,
He didn't know it in the beginning.
No, but the realization, even God said, who are you? Were you here when I set the foundations of the earth? Were you here?
I think it was
No.
the realization after God.
Put him in his, put him in his place. But even then, what Job was doing was not a sin.
Right.
And I find it very interesting, of course, this is where we get our hedge of protection, because Job mentions, Satan says, we lift the hedge of protection from around him, and we pray hedge of protection. I don't know how many people actually realize where it comes from, but that Satan had to ask permission, and God granted permission. And that's a whole other, bag of worms that we can get into about, why would God give Satan permission, and so we're not going to get into that tonight. Maybe we'll study Job and we'll get into it. But that's what I thought about Job. I feel really bad for him. I feel really, really bad for him.
I just recently read Job, and it's like, man, this poor guy.
I know, and
But God prospered him.
Yeah,
he did,
Twice.
even more.
yeah.
Even more. But what also impresses me about Job is, he prayed for his children. He prayed, he taught his children to pray.
And sacrificed for them.
But he also prayed for his children just in case there was something that they forgot.
Yeah.
Not because they weren't praying, not because they weren't following God's laws, but he prayed
Just in case.
for them just in case they forgot something.
He overprayed.
So, but that's his father's heart. That's how much I think he loved his children. He wanted to make sure that everything was covered, that they didn't forget anything. Whether conveniently forgot or not, he just wanted to make sure that they were covered. And so that's what he did. And that also impresses me very much about him, that he was a
But
good
would he have 7
father.
sons and 3 daughters or something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
But after all the testing and all that,
God
he had
doubled
7,
everything.
not his children.
He replaced him, though.
Yeah.
Replaced them.
Yeah.
But
With the same nagging woman.
She must have been. Because his kids were not young.
No, because they
'Cause they
had
were
established
both-
households. They were
That's what I'm
doing
saying.
established households.
So, same woman.
God. That's all I can tell you. God. God
It doesn't
decided.
say it was a different woman.
No,
I mean,
it
so I
doesn't.
can't argue that it was a different woman. But I would think.
Really? Yeah. It's like, really?
Well, but
Yeah, I
she
thought
must have
about
been
that
like
too.
super old.
I thought, man, if she thought she was nagging the first time around, what was she thinking the second time
Yeah,
around?
no kidding, huh? Maybe she was
10 more kids,
Well,
Maybe she was a little happier because, all this livestock.
She was having kids till she was 100 then.
But
But back
they
then it
lived
wouldn't have been a
long
big
time
deal.
back then.
So back
That
then,
was after the flood.
Yes.
So they weren't living that long. God ascribed 120 years and that was it.
Well, she's probably having kids the day she died. But Job, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, right before Psalms. I was trying to see because I never read if it said how old he was or how old she was.
Well, but I mean, they weren't young.
So fair as Job's daughter and their father gave them up. And after that, Job lived 140 years.
After.
And after this, I assume after he had his children, because it lists how many children in chapter 42.
Lived to be 140, not
But it
140 more years.
It says he named the first Jemima, the second Kezia, the third Karen, Hapuch. And then no women were found so fair as Job's daughters, and their father gave them inheritance among their brothers, which was very unheard of. And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his grandsons to the 4th generation. And Job died an old man and full of days.
So he had a good long life after
He did, and it
all
never
his suffering.
tells us
How old his wife was.
how old his wife was. No, I knew they said something about his age, but no.
That's just an aside. I mean,
But he did restore the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord increased all that Job had by 2-fold, so the doubles. And his sisters and all that he'd known came, and they were all
well, and
happy.
we don't know that it was because, tradition was he had wives and concubines, so.
Well, but it never says he did.
But I think the thing that strikes me is, he went through this suffering, and it was just this much compared to the rest of the time that he had.
Right.
It was, and that's what our life and the sufferings that we have are very short when you consider eternity.
Yeah.
Right, yes.
And the
Yeah.
amount,
Absolutely.
what we consider suffering
It's a speck in the ocean.
is a speck compared to what we're gonna have.
Well, and I've told people, I will be well much longer than I was ever sick. But we get into our suffering and we see this far ahead of us. We just see the next day of suffering, or the next time we can take pain meds, or the next time that we had this procedure or that procedure or this test, and we feel like that is forever.
That's because our whole life revolves around us
Yeah.
instead of revolving around God.
Exactly.
That's.
But it's very interesting, and Job is interesting also. The whole prospect of leprosy is very interesting, and where that came from, we talked about that when we talked about Naaman, Naaman, and what leprosy was more of a judgment than it was an actual like a kind of regularly occurring disease. And we looked at that, and we looked a lot in Leviticus, and of course, what did Job end up with? But he ended up with leprosy. But
Also,
ultimately,
never says it was leprosy.
it says that he had spots, and maybe I'm just
It
assuming.
doesn't say it was leprosy.
Maybe I'm just assuming it was leprosy then, because I did think.
Well, it was something that itched because he used to play whatever.
Yeah, so I did. So that was my assumption, but I always
But
assumed
his
it
friends
was
wouldn't have
leprosy.
come around if he had leprosy.
Well, this is
True.
true. And his wife
Or
wouldn't
his
come around,
wife.
unless she just wanted to constantly.
Yeah.
She was a bite sometime of the whole training of child. Oh, that's when he reproves and disciplines. I always like to read my notes because those notes I could actually read.
Yeah, I don't recall it ever saying he had leprosy.
He had leprosy, but I remember he scratched like he would find rocks
He
and
was,
clay
because
pieces.
he
Yeah,
had
they
like
play
boils, I think.
Okay, gotcha. Because I did. I always just assumed it was.
Because they said they were painful.
I can't imagine the ooze and look. All right. Obviously, we're not going to be here next week because nobody wants to feed me here. So we will be back.
Did you get Chuck's email yesterday?
Yes, I did, and I emailed him back. You're on the
Or
list.
did you?
And
He never tells me.
our next meeting that is December 5th. I have your books. It's 10 weeks that we're going to be looking at these next 6 chapters. We start right in next week with chapter 7, which is the prophecy section of Daniel. Very, very, very good section of Daniel.